Now that our application is clean, we can enhance our application. The first thing that we should consider in enhancement is repository. Right now, whenever we are dealing with anything that is related to database, if we examine here, we are directly using application DB context. This is not a good approach. What you should do is you should use a repository pattern so that in future, if you want to change the application DB context, you do not have to change that throughout all of the controllers. You just need to update in one location and everything should be taken care of. That being said, right now, we only have 5 controllers, so updating this won't be an issue. So this seems like a perfect time to implement our repository. Now you can think about when we started this project, we did not think it will be a big large-scale project. It was just a small project. Later on, the enhancement changed so that we now have to implement repository. And this is a common real-life scenario. Repository pattern should come into picture only for mid to large-scale project. If it's a small-scale project, I tend to avoid repository pattern. The reason is it takes time to set up repository pattern, and when you have a repository in place, when you have to make DB changes, the syntaxes also changes. So it adds to the time. But if your application is mid-scale to large scale, it benefits in long run. So now since our requirements have changed, it makes perfect sense to implement a repository pattern. Now in repository pattern, I want a generic repository which will be handling adding a record, finding a record, retrieving all record, one record, and removing a record, along with saving changes to the database. Because if you think about it, we have application type, category, product, and we'll be adding more of those. So whenever we add a new model, we want a specific repository for that model, but that specific repository should implement from a generic repository. So first, let's implement a generic repository, and we'll do that inside Rocky_data access. So in there, if we expand the data folder, we have the application DB context. Right here, let me add a new folder for repository. We'll be adding a generic repository class. We'll call it repository.cs. Then we need to implement it from an interface so that we can use it with dependency injection. So inside repository, let's add a new folder. And I'll call this iRepository. We will add an interface here. We'll go with the new item, interface. We'll name this iRepository and let's add this. Now, as I said before, this interface will first make it public and this will be a generic interface. So for that, we have to define that this interface will be on a class type T and we'll say where T is a class. Now in this, what are all the methods that we want to implement? First, we want to implement a find method, and here we'll be getting the ID of the record that we want to find. What should be the return type? The return type will be generic T. The generics here are the generics with C#. Make sure you have a basic understanding of those. Basically, when we create this iRepository, if we create this on application type, then this T will represent the application type model that we have. So if we want to find some record, it will return an object of application type, which is T. Then we also want a getAll method. So getAll will return more than one record of application type, and in this case it will be generic. We'll call this method as getAll, and what will be the parameters here? The parameter retrieval process gets complex, and the reason is if we go to Rocky, if we go to product controller, and if we scroll down, right here you see you have included few properties, then at some places you'll be adding where conditions, and so on. So for that, we need to make sure we handle all of that in our generic repository. So first thing we want to handle is where conditions. So if someone wants to filter, we can have an expression here and it will expect a function of t, boolean, and we'll call this as filter. This can be null as well if there are no where condition. Next thing, if someone wants to order by, so for that also we'll have a function in which we'll have the iQueryable on generic type t. Right here we have the iOrdered queryable, and this will be on generic type t as well, and we'll call this as order by, which can be null as well. After that, we'll add a string and we'll call this as include properties. Here in a string parameter, if someone wants to include properties, like in product controller, we have included category. So if someone wants to do something like this, you have to pass a string with category. If it's more than one, it can be category, application type. We'll decipher that inside the class where we implement. And lastly, we will add the flag for is tracking is true. By default, all the queries that you run using Entity Framework Core are being tracked. This can be a pain sometimes. If you are using a query only for retrieval purpose and you won't be ever editing it, you can set the is tracking to false so that the query is not tracked and system will be much more efficient. If you think we are hammering too many things right now, do not worry, we will explain all of this and we'll see it in action as well. That being said, you need to have basic understanding of generics and how it works to understand this with C#. But rest assured, as we proceed with the course, I will explain you and will be using repository extensively so that you'll have no doubt by the end of this course. So far we have the find and get all. Let's continue working on this interface in the next video.